Welcome to this edition of Decryptage on Africa 24 English. We are delighted to welcome Mr. NYONG, Director of Climate Change and Green Growth at the African Development Bank. Together, we look at how the ambitious Mission 300 initiative aligns with Africa's green energy potential and commitment. He will also tell us how the African Development Bank is working to bridge this gap, particularly in financing renewable energy projects under Mission 300. Mr. NYONG, thank you and welcome to Africa 24 English. How can African countries ensure that Mission 300 efforts to expand access to electricity are consistent with their climate goals and green growth commitment? Why do African countries need to structure trade finance to participate in the 2024 Afreximbank Trade Seminar?
First, let me commend my president, the president of the African Development Bank Group, Dr. Akinwumi Adesina, the president of the World Bank Group, Mr. Ajay Banga, for this initiative. It's an initiative that should have taken place 20 years ago. But I'm glad that it has finally happened, that the vision of these two leaders with other partners have brought us here together. Africa has a lot of potentials. We've always been talking about the potentials, but we never hardly think about how do we harness those potentials for our development. So currently, this M300 now is a bold step that the world has needed, Africa as a country has needed to harness the abundant resources that it has to take at least half of Africa's population that does not, or to provide electricity access to half of Africa's population that does not have that current access. But having said that, the first thing that makes this unique is that it's not just a talk shop. I heard something here that we're not talking megawatts here, we're going to be delivering megawatts, and which is very important. And that means that beyond here, the respective countries, the respective institutions need to take this forward. What is it that the respective countries need to do? We need to ensure that we design and have policies that will integrate the outcomes of this M300 into their national policies. And those national policies should reflect in the nationally determined contributions. So we don't see this as a separate entity. We've done this. It has to be tied to the targets. How will this help deliver the targets in the nationally determined contributions? How can we modify them if they are not well designed? So it will be very important that we don't see these as separate initiatives, but as one homogeneous initiative to provide electricity access. And then two, we have different partners here. We cannot work alone. No institution can do this alone. So we need to cultivate that partnership that has come up here that says Africa can do it and we can do it as a partnership. That's the second. And the third is the fact that even in the countries, we need to take this up. It's not just an energy issue. If we look at it just as an energy issue, we will run into challenges. It affects water, it affects agriculture, it affects economic development. So there has to be an integrated approach that the Minister of the Economy or Minister of Finance needs to understand how this is affecting the development of the country. And the Minister of Water Resources, though he's not here, he or she is not here, will need to understand how can we incorporate this into my own ministerial policies that will enable us to deliver the energy that can give us water.
The African Development Bank estimates that Africa will need about $2.8 trillion in climate finance by 2030 to meet its climate goals, yet the continent currently receives less than 5% of global climate finance flows. How is the African Development Bank working to close this gap, particularly in financing renewable energy projects under Mission 300?
Thank you very much. Yeah, it looks very scary when you say $2.8 trillion, but that's really what we need, to be able to address climate change issues, which includes energy. But the African Development Bank is doing quite a lot on it. We made a promise that 40% of our climate financing will go to, of our investments will go to climate financing. We have exceeded that. We had reached 55% of our investment, which is very commendable and one of the highest percentages thus far among all our partners. So with our own resources, we have been able to exceed even the targets we set for ourselves. Then we have also set up initiatives like the Climate Action Window that is making money to, or finance, climate finance, to fulfill what we call the major characteristics of climate finance. One is that climate finance must be available, it must be adequate, it must be accessible, and it must be affordable. So most times the money is there, but many African countries cannot access this. So what we have done is we've set up a very strong program that is building capacities of African institutions to be able to access climate finance. You may wish to know that very few African countries are able to, on their own, directly access global funds like the Green Climate Fund. So we're building their capacities on that. Then we're also establishing, like I've said, financial instruments and initiatives. We have the Climate Action Window, which basically is a facility we established that makes resources available to those who need it quickly and in a cheap manner. And that resource puts about 75% of it to adaptation, knowing that that is a goal that we need. Like I mentioned, nobody can do it alone. We're building partnerships with other vertical climate and environment funds like the Green Climate Fund, like the Adaptation Fund, Global Environment Facility, and Climate Investment Funds. So we're working with these organizations, crowding in money. But beyond the direct investments, we're also doing things to bring in the private sector, because the private sector has a very important role to play. So we've set up de-risking mechanisms, instruments that will de-risk projects to allow the private sector to come in.
Given that Africa has 60% of the world's best solar energy resources, but only 1% of global solar capacity, what immediate policy and financial interventions are needed to address this imbalance?
Yeah, like I've said, we keep talking about the potential, 60%, but the reality of what we've harnessed, 1%. So we ask ourselves, what is it that needs to be done to bring this? One, it's the government must effectively utilize public funds well. Public funds or resources should be used to create the enabling environment that will attract the private sector. Private sector goes to where policies are stable, they have assurance of an income. It's not where the reforms are such that you cannot plan. So they need stability. So government need to be able to create stable conditions that would allow investors to bring in their resources. We need to have the right frameworks and the right legislations to allow us to attract the private sector. I'll give you an instance. In several African countries, you have interest rates up to about 30%. And the question is, why would anyone go take money at 30% to do some solar or some solar irrigation that will take a long time to pay off? If I were a trader and I sell Rolls-Royce cars or I sell Mercedes-Benz cars, I could go take such loan, come sell the car, flip it, and go back to get more. But for long-term investments, you can't. So we need to really think, what sort of interest rates regime do we need to attract investors, local investors and foreign investors? And then two, why are we not manufacturing? Why are we not building capacities for manufacturing of some of these solar organs, some of this solar equipment? We should be able to do that internally by ourselves. Thirdly, we can also encourage flow of funds into this. Some years ago, a reputable research company published an article that said African countries put in 22 times the money in subsidy than they actually put in energy generation. So you put 22 times more for subsidy than you actually put in energy generation. I'm not saying remove subsidies, but we can reform our subsidy systems. That if we reformed our subsidy system, that people saw the benefits of investing in renewables, they'll do it. As long as we keep subsidizing fossil fuel very intensely, then we will have issues in that adoption. Let me talk about gas. Everyone runs away from gas as fossil fuel, but for us it's an intermediate fuel. We still have issues with some of the renewable energy technologies, the intermittency, the lack of base load and all that's happening. If we transition through gas while building the capacities for renewables, I think it will take us there faster.
Mr. Anthony Young, thank you for answering Africa's 24 questions. And to our viewers, thank you for watching this program. Stay tuned to Africa 24 English for the best African news in streaming and replay on our website, africa24tv.com, and on all our social networks.